Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'll get us started in just a moment, but I want to give everyone a moment or two connect to audio. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. Welcome. Okay, looks like everyone is coming in and having a chance to connect to audio. So I would like to kick us off then. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Brooke Akins, and on behalf of Q1 Productions and LexisNexis Risk Solutions, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar will discuss creating a more meaningful data token for healthcare. And I'd like to thank LexisNexis Risk Solutions again for sponsoring and developing today's content. We're extremely lucky to have Miss Emily Mortimer, who is the Director of Strategy at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, with us today, and she will be exploring more of the benefits of a solution centered on the patient that produces a compliant and a de-identified token with comprehensive patient tracking. And finally, Emily is going to discuss more about the healthcare specific use cases and the impact on real world outcomes. A note again about our sponsor today, LexisNexis Risk Solutions is passionate about leveraging data and analytics to connect healthcare organizations and the patients they serve in meaningful ways. By applying proprietary technology and advanced analytics to rich data, they deliver actionable insights to healthcare clients to empower informed decisions, helping to ensure compliance, improve financial results, and support better health outcomes. They're headquartered near Atlanta, and the LexisNexis team has offices throughout the world. They're part of Relics, which is actually a global provider of information-based analytics and decision tools for professionals and business customers. Please note that a copy of today's presentation recording will be sent to all registered attendees upon completion of today's webinar, and there will be an opportunity to submit your questions and comments to Emily at any time during the presentation, as we'll be holding Q&A after she's finished speaking. You can submit these via the Zoom toolbar that's on your screen within the Q&A section. And I do encourage you to be as specific as possible when sending through questions and comments. Please feel free to include an example or reference back to a particular area within the presentation to better assist Emily in thoroughly answering your questions. If anyone is dialed in through the telephone today and doesn't have the Q&A option, feel free to submit those questions and comments directly to me via email to webinars@q1productions.com, and I'll ensure they're included. But without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter, Emily Mortimer. Emily is the Director of Strategy with responsibilities for strategy and development activities for the LexisNexis Social Determinants of Health Solutions. In over 8 years at LexisNexis, Emily has served as a subject matter expert for medical claims and analytical solutions, holding roles leading client services and implementation, as well as managing analytics and statistical modeling resources, and contributing to product management strategy and overall management. She has a background in public health epidemiology, holding an MPH from Drexel University School of Public Health. At this time, it's my honor to hand it over to our presenter, Emily Mortimer. Emily, good afternoon. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you for that great introduction. Thanks to everyone who has joined us today, and I really look forward to furthering our conversation. Several of you were able to join us back in August when we had a discussion a little bit about the history of tokenization and really why tokenization is impactful for healthcare. And we wanted to expand upon that today, speaking in more detail about healthcare use cases, and really what differentiates token capabilities that are going to be important in healthcare use cases. So taking a look at the structure a little bit of our conversation today, obviously we'll do introductions as we've already started. We'll talk more and get the group to kind of the same level of information about the LexisNexis patient-centric token capability. We talked briefly about it in our last conversation, but knowing that not everyone was able to join that, I want to make sure that we're all kind of coming from the same base of knowledge. And then we'll expand into tokenization and how it can be used for healthcare. On that front, we started by asking you all a registration question, specifically about how your organization is using tokenization today. And, obviously we were not, able to capture every single way in which it was used, but the main categories are represented here. Just a note, this is not intended to add up to 100 since individuals could select multiple uses within their organization. But I wanted to highlight for everyone so that we can think about kind of what are the main categories of use and how we can speak to those. So, data management and IT pops out as the largest category here. From a kind of industry trends perspective, it may be that this is simply tied to the functional group and the role that they serve in serving as an intermediary between data access, data acquisition, and business use. So they're likely to touch the data, really, whether or not that's the kind of end goal of tokenizing data in healthcare organizations. But the other main categories that are highlighted here are around clinical trials, real-world data, and outcomes research. And they all were captured, somewhere between, a quarter and say a fifth of the folks joining the call today noted that these were use cases at their organization. And I think that's important because, again, when we talk about tokenized data and kind of harkening back to the conversation we had previously, it's important to think about kind of why tokenization matters, right? So industry organizations that are not considered covered entities, that do not have access to patient identified information, have a specific need for tokenized data. And that really fits the bill for things like outcomes research or real world data, if you're talking about data that sits kind of outside of the four walls of your organization. So I wanted to get in a little bit more detail into the LexisNexis patient-centric token. I think a specific point of information that it's worth kind of having a background in is kind of LexisNexis and what our core business is that puts us in a position of resolving this problem. LexisNexis has several years of history and experience in building data acquisition solutions, integrating data, and linking data together on individuals. We're talking here about 40 plus years of experience doing this work, and the industries that trust us to do this work on identified data with various use cases that are outside of healthcare include law enforcement agencies, insurance companies, financial services, lots of experience that we have in proving that our ability to aggregate data on all facets of an individual's life and bring it together accurately on the same individual is, very important. The way I like to think about this when I'm describing it, in kind of layman's terms, I'm certainly not an expert on this process, is to say that LexisNexis really creates an envelope for all information about me, Emily Mortimer. And daily, weekly, monthly, new pieces of information are coming in that relate to me. And the linking work that we do puts that information correctly in my envelope. And the way that envelope appears has changed over time. Today, my name is Emily Mortimer, and I live in Minnesota. A few months ago, I was Emily Mortimer in Pennsylvania. And prior to that, before I was married, my name was Emily Hofer. So our system is, sophisticated enough to create the links in spite of changes to that information and to the identifying PII over time. So taking it a step further, how does that background, how does all that information help us to position a de-identified solution for healthcare? The goal is really to think about how is tokenization performed today and how can it be improved? I mentioned that tokenization is, really relevant for life sciences, for folks who are in a position of, not being considered a covered entity. The approaches that are taken today traditionally look at a single record and the PII available on that record to create a token. So a first name, last name, date of birth is translated into a token about an individual. That tells you something, and that is, it is an approved method to eliminate PII and to provide insight into an individual, but it is also limited by the information that's available. It's not as descriptive as something that would harken back to reference data, and it's going to be vulnerable to the fact that those changes I just mentioned that naturally happen over time could mean that a single person appears in different data sets or in the same data set over time with different combinations of information. The result of that in these blue text boxes here is that you see that an individual, and it looks like the red box got a little bit out of order, but in this case, both the first and second lines, Jane Smith and Janet Smith, because they are at the same location with the same date of birth, the tokenization approaches would often combine those into a single token, token A. And from an, informational perspective, if you look at combining things like claims data or clinical data on that person, it's going to tell you that token A is a patient that has both diabetes and COPD. But when leveraging reference data, LexisNexis actually knows that Jane and Janet Smith are two different people. So there is not one token A that has diabetes and COPD. In fact, token A actually is one record on top, but a couple of additional records. And the second line has been separated out as token B. That gives you, the understanding that you're not going to link together clinical outcomes that are actually unrelated to each other, which is, of course, highly important when you're thinking of the sensitivity of outcomes and other types of research. But it also enables you to see more comprehensive data over time about a patient. So what we know is that Jane Smith moved and Jane Smith got married and changed her name to Jane Jones, but all three of those visits are important to understanding the lifespan of Jane Smith and her experience in healthcare as well as her outcomes. So this is just one way to demonstrate the power of what an improved token can kind of glean in healthcare. In thinking about the reasons why this is important, I think, we've been thinking about this in a theoretical sense, right? Would it matter if it could be more precise, if it could be more accurate? And I think that doesn't really do justice to how much it matters, right? Maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't to some people in theory, but if you can quantify the impact of that, I think it makes a much more clear understanding and indicator of why this is important. So in terms of the frequency of changes to the underlying data, I think it's important to quantify those. Independent research, this is not LexisNexis research, this is, there are links below here, but independent research has shown that 24% of US adults move in a 5-year period and 1.3 million are moving out of state every year. When you consider long-term analyses that span several years of data, the idea that a quarter of your adult population could move in that 5-year span is going to be very impactful to your ability to trace that individual over time and to tie outcomes back to the proper individual. In addition, 2 million marriages occur annually, which is going to result in some subset of name changes as well every year. So when we think about kind of how that drives performance of tokens within healthcare, in particular, looking at how the depth and breadth of data that LexisNexis has really positions us to uniquely address this challenge. In our analyses thus far, we're really seeing an improvement and a heightening of precision of the token itself. So those examples I listed on the prior slide, really precision of up to 20% in the data asset. And this is, when I say up to, it's because it's dependent on how much you're really looking at in the data. If you have a snapshot of 6 months of claims, for instance, you're not going to be as vulnerable to those changes in PII, to people moving, to people changing their name. If you have data that only comes from one source or one system, you might be less vulnerable to those types of changes. But more and more, the industry is moving to bringing together comprehensive data sets that span sourcing, that span facilities, and that span several years of history. And we're seeing that that precision is going to be highly impacted by the ability to drive toward a more precise, more meaningful token. And lastly, thinking about the high confidence and what it really means for research and use cases within life sciences. Looking at the confidence that we can have in the data and outcomes is critical when you consider the ways in which life sciences organizations are driving toward real-world data and real-world evidence, and how that impacts business and impacts things like FDA approval and the future of the ways in which we do business. So looking at kind of one additional view of this, I think it's important to just make sure we're all coming at it with the same understanding. So how the approach works, this is really the same idea that we were displaying in tables previously, but giving you a little bit more of a flowchart view of what happens, right? So a single patient across the top has changes in their identifiable information over time. And this is information that LexisNexis captures. This is where you see changes to address, changes to name, and the ability to connect to other LexisNexis data assets like mortality or SDOH information. All of that can then be de-identified on a patient-centric token, which can enable linking to other data assets, right? So the actual questions that your research is going to want to answer will depend on not only understanding the patient and a token for that patient, but tying it back to various data assets, clinical data, provider data, device data, you name it, there's going to be a very wide variety of data assets that are going to be leveraged to answer research questions within healthcare. So in summary, why is tokenization really key to healthcare? And I think this is, again, about just driving toward precision and accuracy. Some of the history conversation we had last time highlighted that a lot of tokenization capabilities were born out of industries like financial transactions and financial services, places where privacy may have been prioritized over precision or longitudinal accuracy. And I think it's important to make sure that we're not leveraging, square solutions to fit round peg holes here. We have the opportunity to build a solution that is explicitly driven towards solving healthcare problems. There's confidence in results that can be linked on consistently matched records across data sets. So the idea that our industry is moving more and more toward combining data assets is an important component of why this matters. It's not just about your internal data and how to put it on a token that you have a high level of confidence in. It's about bringing together data assets. And the need to do that is only expanding, not contracting. And I think a final point I want to raise here is just on the negative events. So I think in particular, when we think about research, when we think about healthcare, visibility into negative events in terms of outcomes is really highly important. And being able to dive into things like capturing of mortality or capturing of social determinants of health and more about the patient's experience outside of the medical space is really going to do more to drive our research into a holistic view of the patient going forward. So that was how we kind of set the stage on what the patient-centric token is and how it's going to really be beneficial when we think about healthcare. And I wanted to, pivot a little bit now to talk specifically about those healthcare use cases and about the ways in which we see healthcare as a very specific type of industry that's driving toward a different solution. When we think about analytics and research within healthcare, specifically here, I'm kind of highlighting pharmaceutical company research. Several of you, I'm sure, are much more experts than I am in this field, but I'm just going to, level set a little bit so that we're all speaking about the same thing. We hear a lot about efficacy and effectiveness when it comes to products in the market. And a lot of the kind of historical clinical trials that were done were really driving toward the idea of measuring the potential performance of an intervention in very controlled circumstances. So that's really efficacy here on the left side of the slide. Being able to say, when I've controlled for every potential confounder out there, and I've given you the ideal set of circumstances, does this intervention have an effect? And that's really important when you want to know the true effect of, a drug or a product, but that's not allowing you to mimic the conditions of the, real world. So on the right side, you see kind of effectiveness defined as understanding how the intervention performs under real world conditions. And there are, pharmaceutical companies have the ability to select one or both of these approaches when they're considering trials that they might want to undertake. And of course, historically, we've leveraged a lot of the, actual real world information, meaning what happens once the drug is released to try to capture some of the effectiveness data going forward. But it's important to note that these two things are not exactly the same and that more and more with a focus on real world data and real world evidence, we're driving toward expanding our ability to comment on effectiveness and drive toward effectiveness. So similarly, I wanted to kind of set the stage here on real world data. Specifically, real world data gets talked about a lot, but I wanted to note that it's kind of defined as data that relates to patient health status or the delivery of healthcare. It can come from a variety of sources. Everyone on this call is probably familiar with things like electronic health records, claims and billing activities, but it's also important to think about other sources like disease registries or things that are happening for in-home use, like data that's generated from in-home care or from products that are used in the home. And more moving toward data gathered from digital sources like mobile devices and wearable products. So there's a lot of potential sources of real world data information. There's also the reality that real world data is just the data in and of itself, but in definition, there is the idea that you could be leveraging that data to generate real world evidence, which is really thought of as the evidence that is driving other purposes, thinking about what is happening in the world and how do we measure that effectiveness. But this data that exists can be used for other purposes, considering the feasibility of a trial, considering hypothesis development, maybe not for the product at hand, but maybe you're trying to consider other products to, expand into, and identifying geographically diverse research targets. So there's a lot that can be done with the data, and that doesn't necessarily mean that all real-world data is tied to real-world evidence. When we get into the evidence itself, we're talking here about the usage and potential benefits or risks of medical products, and that is real-world evidence is derived from real-world data. So there's a lot of different study designs and analyses that can be used here. I'm not going to kind of dive into those with specific detail, but the important part, I think, is to consider that, the way that the FDA is moving forward, traditional trials, which we can talk offline about how they define that, will not be considered real-world evidence, right? So they focus on kind of efficacy as a trial that's done in a very concrete and controlled manner, and separating that from real-world evidence. Specifically, this is becoming really important because kind of moving into worlds in which the FDA is not just looking at real-world evidence to consider like safety or potential side effects, but potentially enabling companies to submit real-world evidence analyses as part of actual trial discussions, and being able to drive, traditionally beyond just safety, being able to think of efficacy and effectiveness under a different lens. So it's going to allow companies to shift the way they do business and kind of focus on the data and the evidence and how that can drive things forward. A little bit more about kind of why here. So under the 21st Century Cures Act, they specifically called for the FDA to evaluate how real-world data would be used. And sorry, there's a typo here. Use the real-world data to generate real-world evidence, specifically for new indications, right? So here's the kind of difference. We're not just saying use the real-world evidence to understand safety. We're talking about being able to generate evidence to drive toward new indications of drugs or for post-approval study requirements. I think that's a big task. It sounds like a small bullet, but it's a lot of evaluation that's happening. And the FDA has issued their first guidance on this topic. So it is at this point in draft stage, and it is not something that comes with, necessarily any kind of policy behind it, but it is a draft of recommendations for how this, should be used. Specifically, in this draft, the FDA has issued guidance around consideration of source data that appropriately addresses study questions and understanding the importance of data linking and synthesis. So in this guiding document, the FDA is talking about the idea that not all data can be leveraged for specific problems. So claims data comes with a purpose, EHR data comes with a purpose, and sometimes your study question is better served by one or the other or a combination of both. The other, kind of limitations of use is important. So there's a lot of nuances to the guidance around how do you leverage different fields, and what if the fields are completed in a kind of incomplete or inconsistent manner. In particular, as it relates to EHR data, this is commonly a problem. So the FDA is really getting into the business of saying, not all real-world data is created equal, and it's not all going to be equally valuable in generating real-world evidence for your use. So think about the sourcing and how to align it. I think their commentary on, in particular, the linking and synthesis of data is also very interesting. It demonstrates that FDA has a really good understanding of the fact that really no one set of data is going to enable a pharma company or a med device company to answer their business questions independently. So knowing that you're considering how to link those data assets together and having a high confidence in that is highly important. Certainly FDA is part of this guidance is, a reminder to everyone that we are all under the HIPAA policies that enable us to work with de-identified data only. And the FDA is really highlighting that in that structure, there's less ability to kind of validate the work that's been done, right? So if two records are matched or linked on a de-identified token, often a research team will not have the ability to go back in and validate that result. And that creates a potential, challenge. So I highlight all of this because it really gets into kind of why tokenization is important for real world data at this point, and why it's something that is really moving forward into the forefront of everyone's kind of focus. And when we talk about how tokenization and how the patient-centric token can uniquely solve for this challenge, I think it's really about putting the pieces together in a way that addresses this specific discussion. Real-world data means we need to have information on a de-identified patient. We need to link that data with a high level of confidence and consistency. We need to control for confounders in the data. We need to match data across a wide set of sources to get a complete picture of the patient. And that is a pretty big challenge. So imagine that your organization has set out to understand how they could, say, place the results of an efficacy trial that they have already completed into the context of the real world, without waiting for several years of data to accumulate, or without waiting for an additional trial. Right? Trials come with a big price tag. They also take a whole lot of time and priorities away from other team members. So being able to drive forward with real world data to complement a trial that has already been completed could be a really important part of the picture and the business strategy. But what does it look like to kind of solve for that problem? So put together kind of data assets that can offer a complete picture of the patient. We're looking at the medical events and the EHR records, potentially also a robust view of the patient information outside of healthcare, something like social determinants of health, information that could tie back to, say, a mortality indicator, and create a robust picture of that patient on a patient-centric token that offers increased precision and accuracy. This company could then leverage data and analytics across that spectrum of data to assess effectiveness, identify any gaps between efficacy and real-world treatment impacts, and do all of that at a lower cost than completing a large trial. Not only a lower cost, but likely do it more quickly than completing another trial. So thinking about the challenge that is set out with real-world data and the opportunities that exist, I think it's important to consider that the solution that we're talking about here, the patient-centric solution to tokenization, is particularly impactful in solving this type of problem. If I'm being a little bit lofty in my goals for a moment, I also want to comment, as I noted in the introduction, I am responsible for our social determinants of health solution. And one thing that I engage in a lot of conversations in that context is around health equity. So if we think about how real world data can make a difference to a pharmaceutical business, I also want to think about how real world data can make a difference to the health of our country, to communities, to individuals for whom maybe clinical trial representation is limited, and therefore we don't often have a great understanding of the effectiveness of that product in that community. I think we can all see the bigger picture and take a moment to take a little pie in the sky and think about how this has not only positive impacts for our companies and our bottom lines, but positive impacts for our communities and for the health of the country. So on that note, I want to segue into kind of a different mindset. So at the beginning of the conversation, we noted that a lot of you responded that data management and IT teams were involved in tokenized data efforts at your companies. And we wanted to talk a little bit about what the patient-centric token can mean from a data management perspective. I think in this context, we probably are all sick of hearing it, right? But big data has been a buzzword for about 10 years in the industry, and moving toward an understanding of the fact that our amount of data that is generated in healthcare and the responsibility over protecting that data is not going to go away. In fact, it's just growing. So today, research shows that 30% of the world's data volume has been generated by the healthcare industry, and that will continue to grow over the next several years. With that, certainly, we all are familiar with the idea that there's a lot of responsibility. There's also a lot of opportunity to think about what we can do with that data. So the fact that there's a lot of information doesn't necessarily mean that it's being utilized or that we're getting the value out of it that we could. So, we talk about the amount of data, but interestingly, the field of big data as a science or as a study is really focused not just on volume, but on using that data to really analyze and systematically extract information from large data sets that are generally too large to be dealt with by any kind of traditional, warehousing or other application software. So with my minimal technical expertise, I'll say this is data where I couldn't just run a SQL query. I couldn't put it in an Excel spreadsheet and run a pivot table. This is really a whole other level of information in terms of how much there is, but also in terms of the untapped potential for how it could be used. And I think because of that, we know that there is a lot of risk as it relates to this data. There's a continued focus on securing it, on managing it effectively, but knowing the benefits there to not only our kind of organizations, but the benefits to kind of health at large, it's worth it to kind of take on those challenges and figure out a way to go forward safely and effectively. So not to put the fire of fear in all of you, but when I went to look at sort of how we talk about health security in the news as it relates to health data, I saw a number of situations in which there were kind of compliance challenges and data breaches. I think these get a lot of attention, right? We know that data breaches come with specifically fees assessed. If it's a breach of protected health information, HIPAA has standards around non-compliance and what the fees are associated with that. I found in one case, depending on the type of violation, that you could be looking at monetary penalties of over $40,000 daily per violation, which means potentially per record. So we're not talking about pennies here. This is a significant potential challenge. And in this case, these headlines are really focused on things that I mentioned earlier as growing in popularity and as growing in focus from a real world data perspective. So thinking about wearables, Fitbit apps, thinking about other kind of healthcare connectivity apps. These are places where data continues to grow and where the information is, potentially not protected in the way that it should be. Specifically, one of these breaches was a company called Get Health, where they were really focused on unifying data from wearable devices, medical devices, and apps. So we're talking here about information that makes a lot of sense that you would want to connect it, right? The value in connecting those things is clear, but the risk associated with creating that connection is also there. So this kind of brings me to another kind of category of data exchange, right? So we wanted to talk for a minute about remote patient monitoring. I mentioned wearables, and there's a lot of things that you would put in the category of more like consumer devices, but remote patient monitoring and medical devices is also a continued focus. This is not, just specific to things like telehealth and the COVID-19 pandemic, but it certainly has increased to some degree here. The focus on basically how can we leverage information technology to gather additional patient data, to understand more information about the patient, but also to respond more readily to patient concerns. And remote patient monitoring is really the venue for that. In 2020, we had over 23 million patients receiving remote patient monitoring services. This, some of it is pretty transparent in terms of having a blood pressure monitor that then would send the blood pressure measurements back to the physician so that they could capture something like a spike in blood pressure. Glucose monitoring for diabetics, right? These are all things that make sense. And it enables kind of the transmission of health information to providers. Looking at remote patient monitoring, and again, considering the risk assessment piece, there's obviously a lot of information that is flowing. And when you consider data flowing back to the provider, one would imagine that then the constraints around that data are going to be, it will fit back into a system that already exists about how they protect that patient's PII and PHI. And that's a really kind of, mature system. There's a lot of experience in healthcare systems with protecting that information. But the in-between phase, right? Who is the kind of go-between company that's driving that? What is their area of focus? Do they have data that's retained within their app or elsewhere? Those are the kinds of questions to kind of focus on as it relates to some of these opportunities. And a report from the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence highlighted that without privacy or cybersecurity controls in place within the remote patient monitoring ecosystem, patient data and the ability to communicate with care providers may be compromised. So here we're talking about kind of two types of risk, right? Not only that sensitive data could be breached, but even that the system in place to allow that feedback mechanism to the provider could be lost. And then you lose the benefit of the remote patient monitoring. So I think it's a really interesting use case to think about the data and the kind of protections that are tied to it. And the way that I think about this is, today there's a lot of benefit to the flow of information, but we probably need to be asking ourselves the questions about kind of what data needs to flow where and what data needs to be stored where and in what way. Imagine a secure, de-identified data storage approach for something like remote patient monitoring. Imagine that patient data could be stored where sensitive information had been consistently masked off of the patient so that you can maintain and link with high confidence over time, but that the data at rest is protected. Picture a system that could enable connections to data that was once highly protected and separated. So data silos that exist within every organization today. Does tokenizing that data create the ability to improve data sharing and improve the consistent ability to access data across your organization, of course, where appropriate? Imagine the ability to, kind of have a more consistent view of the patient when you're looking at evaluation of data for trends or an improved understanding of the patient experience, say with your medical device. And then imagine that the approach to data storage here reduces the risk of PII and PHI leak due to a data breach, and of course, the compensatory fines associated with those types of breaches. There's just, picture a system that's not only, yielding efficiencies in data storage and security, but reducing risk at the same time. I think there's a lot to be said from balancing the benefits of risk, the balance of mitigating that risk, and understanding what are the opportunities. How do we better understand patients by having access to more data? And is removing sensitive things like PII what we need in order to explore how we access more information? So again, on this kind of view of the solution, we're talking about the accuracy and consistency tied to the patient-centric token. We're talking about the fact that your data could be securely de-identified from a storage and reduction in risk perspective, but that it would still be as up-to-date and as actionable, and it would not in any way limit the ability to kind of monitor the patient or improve the patient experience. If anything, it would likely expand the ability to do all those things. So we wanted to end here by kind of transitioning into another question for the audience, thinking about kind of what more do we have to say about this topic? What more do we want to learn? And where are the interests of your organization moving? So Brooke was going to launch a poll here to allow the folks on the phone to respond. Thank you, Brooke.
Yep, so, and sorry, go ahead, just launched now, but go ahead, Emily, please.
Great. No, I was just going to say, so the question here is really, what more do you want to learn about tokenization or the patient-centric token? And you can select multiple responses here. I apologize, there's no open-ended option, but would you like folks to respond in the chat if they have another open-ended answer, Brooke?
Absolutely. Let me open up the chat for that, and we will be sending a post-event survey where they can also, but I've just opened up the chat. So again, if an option is not there that you would like to get further details on, please feel free to drop that in the chat. And once more, we're asking, what more do you want to learn about tokenization or patient-centric tokens? And Emily has kindly provided us with quite a few options there. You can select more than one, as we certainly recognize that you might have more than one need there, and definitely feel free to drop any additional information in the chat. I'm going to keep this poll open for about another 15 or 20 seconds, so please feel free to drop your answers in. Our options are how to discuss tokenized data needs within my organization, how to use tokenized data assets, how can my business use this technology? How can I tokenize my patient data? More details about the PCT and more details on HIPAA considerations for tokenized data. Closing this off. And Emily, it's looking like 75% we're looking for, actually, let me share it with you. We've got 60% on how can I tokenize my patient data. Also about 60% on the more details on HIPAA considerations. And looks like second place here is how to use tokenized data assets and how can my business use this technology. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, this is excellent. So I didn't do a great lead into that. I think that some of those are questions that are really going to be best kind of structured in another longer conversation. And we are hoping to, bring more content in December to have another session with the group. I think specifically the question of kind of how do I tokenize my data is often best a kind of one-on-one conversation rather than instructions to a group. But getting more into the HIPAA details is something that was already on my mind to talk about. And I think that's great guidance on kind of where to go from here. But with that shared, I also wanted to make sure to leave some time for Q&A from today's session. So if anyone has questions, did you say, Brooke, that you opened up the chat?
I did open up the chat as well. People can drop questions there. I know we've had someone dialed in through the phone who has sent me 2 questions, so I will kick off with those. But yes, everyone, we do have time dedicated to Q&A. This is a great opportunity to provide comments and questions to Emily. But Emily, let me start with this one that our phone participant sent via email. Again, if email is easier for you guys, please feel free to send them directly to me via webinars@q1productions.com. This attendee is saying, may I ask where LexisNexis gets their data for this solution? Apologies if I missed this in the first webinar. I ask because how are these data providers handling gaps in data from remote patient monitoring, which you hit on? This question has to do with ensuring data accuracy. So again, asking where LexisNexis gets their data for the solution, and asking because I'm curious how those data providers are handling gaps in data from from remote patient monitoring specifically.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And please, no apologies. The assumption is definitely not that everyone will have attended prior sessions. I think the important thing is to kind of differentiate which solution we're talking about, right? So the patient-centric token itself is one capability, and I'll speak for a moment about kind of data sourcing for that. But the solution more holistically is talking about bringing together various data sources. And those are not all data sources that are under LexisNexis purview right now. So, imagine, a health system that a life sciences company wants to contract with to access their data for the purposes of analysis. That data could be tokenized on the patient-centric token to partner with other data sources that a life sciences company would want to use. So that's not all data that is owned and kind of maintained by LexisNexis. But as it relates to the patient-centric token itself, the referential identity data on an individual is a core LexisNexis solution. In an identified world, we offer solutions like LexID and information that allows individuals to really not only remediate their own data systems and think about CRM systems and things like that, but also ensure that they have the most accurate and up-to-date information to, say, contact a patient that's in their system. So all of that is really undergirded by that consumer data asset that I mentioned was built upon kind of 40 years of history and working in other areas of kind of the business, not just healthcare, but working across insurance and financial services. So here we're talking about several petabytes of data on individuals acquired over many years. This is public records information. There are some proprietary sources, some credit bureau information. There's a lot of information in there that ties back to understanding a complete and comprehensive view of an individual as an identified data asset. And the new capability that LexisNexis is launching is one that takes that and uses it to power a de-identified patient-centric token. So hopefully that helps to address the question of kind of data sourcing and how that information ties back to the conversation today.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. Thank you to Martin for his comment that you're getting some great ideas out of this. Emily, a secondary question that I got via email. Does your solution have an option for re-identifying data if the situation was warranted compliantly? So again, looking at once it's identified, re-identifying when warranted within compliance.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think what's really unique about the patient-centric token is that the kind of a core assumption underneath it does not necessarily have to be that all data upon which a token can be placed must be de-identified. So some of those details are going to be left up to kind of the data origination site or the data supplier, right? So if you are talking about tokenizing your own data, depending on what else you are combining that with is really going to dictate whether something needs to be a HIPAA compliant de-identified solution versus I can imagine a scenario in which someone wants to use the token as part of a kind of cleanup effort internally, but it's always being used on data that they have the rights to see in an identified fashion. So there's nothing explicit in the solution that forces things to be used in a de-identified manner, but it supports de-identified use cases. And the details of that would need to be determined based on what is coming together and why.
Great, thank you. And thank you so much for these great questions. We've got a few minutes left. If anyone wants to raise their hand, I can even unmute you and come on if you'd want to ask Emily a question. We are preparing for our third webinar in this series, and we'll be out with details soon for that. So we'll definitely be in touch with everyone. But any further questions or comments for Emily with regards to today's content, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A or the chat. You can even raise your hand if you'd like, and I can unmute you so you can vocalize. I know some of these are a bit more detailed. Emily, while we're waiting on that, any further questions or closing remarks from your end before I sign us off?
I think, the most important thing that I want to say here is that the intent of the use cases we described today is not meant to summarize sort of the, end of what could be done here. And I think there's a lot of, folks on the phone and people who are doing this work hands-on within pharmaceutical and med device companies who are going to have more ideas about how this capability can be leveraged, where it adds the most value. And we in no way want to shut down that kind of feedback. So if there are folks out there who are thinking, oh, I wonder if it could be used in this way, we welcome that question and that conversation, and we would encourage you to reach out. And I can put here our contact information. And I think also after the last session, a few people reached out to me on LinkedIn directly. That's perfectly fine as well. But we want to kind of continue to engage in this conversation and explore the ways in which this technology can be leveraged to improve your business.
Absolutely. Great thoughts there. Thank you again to all of our attendees for investing your time with us today. We certainly hope that you found the information helpful, and we will be in touch with the dates for our third iteration in the series. Of course, if you've missed any of the first two, we also have further details on those. I will be in touch with a copy of the recording as well, so please be on the lookout for that. But thank you again to all of our attendees. We hope that you found today's information useful. I truly cannot thank the LexisNexis Risk Solutions team enough, specifically today's featured presenter, Emily Mortimer, Director of Strategy. Emily, definitely looking forward to working with you on our third iteration, jumping a bit more into HIPAA compliance and how tokenization works there, as well as how some of our individuals might develop a patient-centered token within their organization. So thank you again to the LexisNexis team. You can follow them on Twitter at Lexis Healthcare. LinkedIn, as Emily said, we're available to answer any questions, and the LexisNexis team is fantastic. So I will be in touch later today with a copy of the presentation recording for everyone. Any further questions or comments for Emily, please don't hesitate to contact her directly or reach out to me. I can be reached at webinars@q1productions.com. Thank you so much for your time, everyone. Looking forward to seeing you back a bit in December for our third iteration that's going to go into some more use cases. Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brooke, and thanks everyone for joining.
Everyone, have a wonderful day. Be safe and be well. Thank you. Bye-bye.